It's easier to know when a flight, obviously, when a flight has produced a contrail, whereas a flight that hasn't produced a contrail, and why they haven't produced it. Was it because the prediction was wrong to begin with? Or was it because they have indeed successfully
Avoided.
avoided a
Yeah.
contrail area? Which is very interesting. And I think it's now what the industry is moving towards. So there seems to be a consensus. There's more public visibility about contrails and non-CO2 effects. And it seems, okay, non-CO2 effects and contrails are a reality. They seem to be at least as warming as CO2. So this has to be taken seriously.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Alejandra Martin Frías. She is the head of sustainability research at FLIGHTKEYS, a software company that focuses on contrail management and has done a ton of research, including publishing research with Breakthrough Energy, Google, and the Imperial College London on how contrail can be reduced and its warming impacts can be limited. They have experimented with tens of thousands of flights and realized that the cost increase for reducing contrails can be as little as 0.05% of a flight, and yet the warming impact can be reduced by over 70%. Now that's very encouraging. Alejandra and I completely geek out on some of these details. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Alejandra, welcome to the podcast. For those who are unaware, can you just give us a background of what FLIGHTKEYS does and what your role is at FLIGHTKEYS?
Yes, 100%. So first, thank you very much for having me. It's very exciting to be here and to be one of the first Contrail episodes. So I've been working for FLIGHTKEYS for 3 years. I am the head of sustainability there, and FLIGHTKEYS is a flight planning software company. We are one of the main flight planning software companies out there, and we offer products to airlines. We have 3 core products. One is FLIGHTKEYS 5D, which is directed for the flight dispatchers to plan flights certain hours before departure. Then we have the NEFB for pilots in flight to follow the most optimal route in real time. And then we have SpaceKeys, which is used by not only airlines, but also other flight planning providers and different aviation companies, which does rain prediction, so GPS satellite prediction. And we're known to be one of the most innovative flight plan software companies out there, specifically when it comes to research activities. We always like to be at the head of any specifically sustainability topic that might come. We like to research it and to see how we can implement it for our customers who always have the most environmentally friendly solutions also available to them.
And when you say customers, do you typically work with airlines or others as well?
It's airlines. So we operate with airlines all around the world. We have quite a big grasp on the American market. We work with American Airlines, Southwest, Jet2Com, for example. And we also have some European customers, Volotea, TUI, cargo companies, Air New Zealand as well. So we usually work with airlines.
So you mentioned American Airlines. Why don't we start there? You recently were part of a big study with American Airlines simulating contrail avoidance. What were the results of the study and what were some of the challenges you encountered?
So that paper that we published in February of this year. We simulated approximately 85,000 flights, I think like 84,800 flights of American Airlines, 2 weeks in June, 2 weeks in January.
And did you say 85,000 flights?
Yes, 85,000 flights.
American Airlines had 85,000 flights in
4
1 month?
weeks. Yep.
In 4 weeks?
Yep.
That's insane.
Approximately 49,000 in summer. So the summer season has more flights than the winter season, and
Of
then the
course.
rest
Wow.
in winter. But yeah, that's the good thing of, I would say, like big. I mean, not the good thing of big airlines, but you can take very short time frames and test a high amount of flights. And yeah, so we simulated 85,000 flights in our test environment. We took them directly from the American production system. So the good thing about FlightKeys, when it comes to simulating contrail avoidance, is that we have a very precise or a very realistic way of simulating flights, because we actually have the aircraft performance data, we have the scheduling data, we have the masses, we have the payload, we have the cost index, all of these things. So we can really simulate how this flight would have happened in real life. So what we do is that we import them from the production environment into our lab environment, and there we run contrail flights. So we analyze all of them with a contrail model. We see how many of these flights would have predicted to form contrails, and then we start testing around how many flights we would need to reroute in order to get a meaningful reduction in contrail energy forcing. In the paper, we simulated three possible scenarios. The first one was to reroute every single flight that generated a warming contrail, which would be around 11,000 out of the 85,000. More in winter than in summer. So again, the idea was to also check the weather variability. Then we simulated the so-called big hits. The big hits is a concept that Mark Stettler and Roger Teo from the Imperial College kind of brought up several years ago in one of their papers, which they say that approximately 2% of all flights that generate contrails are actually responsible for the biggest amount of warming, for like 80% of warming. And the idea is that we don't have to reroute every single flight that generate warming contrails in order to have a meaningful reduction. And then we performed a third type of rerouting, which was based on cost. So we kind of like said, okay, what are those flights that we can reroute for the minimum cost and yet have the biggest reduction impact? So you kind of like set up this threshold of, okay, what are the most cost efficient reroutings we can perform for the biggest reduction? And our results were really, really positive. That's, I guess, why we're here, and that's why we're known within the contrail world. So if we reroute 11,000 flights, so the maximum flights we could reroute, we will get a reduction in energy forcing of close to 75%, with an increase in fuel and cost of less than 1%. So an increase in fuel of 0.11% and an
Wow,
increase in cost
0.1%. Not even one, there's 0.1%.
0.1%.
And you're
And
talking about a reduction in radiative forcing, which is basically the warming effect, non CO2 warming effect of aviation,
exactly.
by how many percent you said for these 11,000 flights?
72.95. I have the results here because if not, I also forget the numbers.
Wow, so 73% reduction by just having a 0.1% increase in cost. That sounds like a good deal to me.
That is a very good deal. And that is something that is kind of like, I guess we will discuss it further along in the questions, but that's something that we always get pushbacks from the airline, which we understand, which is kind of like the fear of, well, but we're going to burn way more CO2, way more fuel in order to achieve contrail reduction. And that is not really true. So the simulations that we are performing indicate that we actually need very little increase in fuel and very little increase in cost to actually have a meaningful potential reduction in contrail energy forcing. So the increase in cost was 0.08, so again, less than 0.1%, to achieve a reduction of 73%. And if we look at the other two scenarios, which were even more interesting, so for example, if we take the big hits, we would have an increase of fuel of 0.05% and an increase of cost of 0.03% and a decrease in contrail energy forcing of 66%.
This is
So
that 2% of the flight leading to 80% of
exactly.
warming impact.
And for this case, we would need to reroute 2,200 flights instead of 11,000 flights. So also for
And
ATC and for the dispatchers, it would be way better.
wow, this sounds like, a very digestible, easy win for me. And what region do these fly over? At what time of the day or what time of the year?
We've used American Airlines for the simulation, so
Yeah.
that usually American Airlines flies across the US, obviously, and then they have some flights to Europe. flights
Yeah.
to South America and some flights through the Pacific to Japan and I guess to Australia.
Right.
And
And I'm
so,
wondering, for this big hit
mhm.
list, where do these typically, are these transatlantic primarily? Are these, over the US? Where do these big hit flights fly?
We didn't find a specific pattern to it. So, or at least not throughout like 4 weeks of simulations. What we really tried to do was to kind of look at the operational implications and not so much the meteorological patterns that come from this. I think this is already done by other papers like Mark Stetler's and Roger Teo's, and they do, and Breakthrough Energy, so other organizations look at this, Estuer, and what they see is that there seems to be a pattern that kind of like proves that, for example, in the mid altitudes, North Hemisphere, between Europe and the US and the North Atlantic is where we have the most warming contrails. Um, Most warming contrails seem to happen at the late hours of the day, night, and very, very early hours of the morning. But that's not something that it's like, oh, it's not because in our simulation in 4 weeks, we clearly saw that those 2% of flights clearly matched this description. But over, if they analyze the entire world flights and they take the
Right.
swim feed and they make like huge simulations, and that's why they see that the patterns really emerge
Okay.
throughout an entire year. But that was not the core goal of this
Fair enough. And
simulation.
now, and I know we digress. So you talked about the first group of 11,000 flights, the second group of 2,200 flights, I think, and what was the third group?
The third group was we selected them based on cost, and the results were very similar to the big hits. We would also need to reroute 2,400 flights, so 200 more. I mean, and this cost, so in this case, I think we selected a value of $1 per ton of per ton of CO2 equivalent.
What do you
So
mean by a value of $1?
so because I said we are checking, okay, what is the cost per reduction of energy forcing? So we kind of like took this value of we divided the cost by energy forcing reduction. So we
Okay.
took in our data sheets, we took cost and we divided by energy forcing. And then you can select a threshold of how much you want to pay in order to reduce certain amount of tons of CO2 equivalent. So you
Okay, I
have to
think
imagine
we're
like
getting very very deep very quickly. So let me zoom out here for some listeners who may not be so familiar. My understanding is when we're talking about cost, you are specifically looking at fuel costs. And when you say a cost reduction increase of 0.8% or 0.5%, or 0.1%, you are looking at an increase in fuel burn and hence fuel cost. No? Please
not
clarify.
really. So many people think that the most, and this is something that I was also prepared for other questions, um, which links a bit to the whole hypocrisy surrounding contrail avoidance. But it's
Mhm.
that the fact that many people think that the main, I mean, and it is one of the main costs, but that when we perform routings for airlines, we are usually calculating the minimum cost, the minimum fuel route. But that is not really true. Every single flight optimizer out there, they perform for minimum cost. And it's not the same as minimum fuel because there's many things that come into play in the cost formulation, from engine cycle cost to fuel cost to overflight charges. That is how much it costs for a specific flight to cross a specific airspace. And in the case of Europe, for example, this is quite complex. Every single country has a different cost to fly. So it's different to fly through Switzerland, maybe. I don't know the cost, but I can imagine Switzerland will be more expensive and it's in the middle of everything, for example. So maybe it's cheaper for you to fly through Italy. And then that's why
Right.
sometimes, when you hear the pilot say, yeah, at the beginning of the flight, so we're going to take off, we're going to go down to this, and we're going to go up here, and then we're going to land from the south to this area, and you think, what a weird route. Why don't they just cross
Fly
straight?
straight. Yeah.
And that could also be because crossing straight might mean that you have to cross through more expensive areas, and then instead you decide to do a detour. So you're
So
not
much for that beautiful view of Mont Blanc when landing in Geneva.
exactly, exactly. You're like, but I wanted to see. You
Yeah,
cannot
I
see it
missed that
because it's
view.
exactly. So it's a very complicated cost formulation that leads to the minimum cost for the airlines. And of course, airlines they have different fuel prices. So usually airlines they agree of a fuel price with a fuel provider for a specific period of time, and then that price is set. And this is something that it's not, the public doesn't know. I don't know what is their prices, but I guess our optimizer does know. And then airlines that have negotiated higher prices then will have a higher fuel price, and then maybe they would try to fly with less fuel, whereas airlines that have cheaper prices would be willing to take longer detours to save cost in other areas.
It's
So
very interesting to understand this cost breakdown, because I think for the novice, it may just mean jet fuel. But yes, there are engine cycles, overflight rates. Try flying over Russia, for example, right now. I'm sure it's
time
a different
cost,
ballgame. Mm-hmm.
delay cost. So, I mean, we can have an entire podcast based on costs.
Okay,
But
good. So
it's
you're overall looking at the entire cost being reduced or increased by 0.1% or 0.5%.
exactly. So sometimes if the cost, that's why we talk in terms of cost. Also, airlines like to talk in terms of cost. But it's not like, okay, just because you set a price of $1 to a contrail, it's not $1 of fuel. It's $1 in the entire cost of this flight, which can be divided in different cost calculations, so to say.
Very, very, very interesting. Now, I want to just dig into the big hits as well. How do you differentiate between what's a warming contrail versus what's a cooling contrail? Because my understanding, my basic understanding is contrails are these ice crystals formed of soot and other gases. Because they are way high up, this ice reflects heat back to the earth at night and reflects heat back to the space in the daytime. So I'm guessing in general, the early morning or afternoon ones are cooling contrails and the evening and overnight ones are warming contrails. Is that generally right? And how do you differentiate in your study?
So in our study, and this links to our collaboration with Google Research, Breakthrough Energy, Imperial College. So usually people think that FLIGHTKEYS does the actual modeling of these models, of the controlled models. So there's different control models. They're based on weather data. They're based on, now there's more machine learning algorithms trying to improve this data. So there's different type of models, and the industry is trying to improve them. So the academia and research groups are trying to improve them. But as FLIGHTKEYS, we don't really design them. We just implement them. And what we do is that we analyze a flight using, for example, the PyContrails, library. Well, the API, actually, we send them to break through a flight, and then they return a value of energy forcing, of how warming or cooling this flight was generated. And how Breakthrough knows how warming or cooling that flight was, that is a great question. So yeah, there's general consensus of, for example, during the night, they're always warming because there's no reflecting back to space. During the day, that can be cooling or warming, or a combination of both based on how long they last in the atmosphere. For example, you can have a contrail that was produced in, I don't know, 6 p.m. in the afternoon, and it can begin as a cooling contrail, but then as the night starts going to the night, it lasts several hours, and then it turns into warming after a certain point. I guess it also depends on generally on maybe things like the albedo of the reflecting quality of the Earth, or if there's other clouds in the area.
Sorry, what is this word again? Albedo?
Albedo.
How do you spell that?
Albedo. So
albedo. Okay, what is albedo? I learned a new word today.
Albedo is albedo is the capacity of the surface to reflect radiation back to space on its own. So, for example, you say the snow has a very, I think, low albedo. I always get confused which one is the high albedo and low albedo, but basically snow reflects everything right back. It's like a mirror, hits, goes right back to space. You know, because, for example, a forest traps the radiation within its grounds, right? And yeah, so it's the capacity of the surface to actually suck in the radiation or to reflect it right back. So, for example, a contrail that is formed over snow, outside of reflecting radiation back, the radiation actually manages to fall into the earth, will then be reflected right back into the contrail, and the contrail can actually trap it back as well. you know? And I don't know how this plays. So if you tell me, okay, so what's better or worse, if we're in the sea or if we're in the desert or we're, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not
The albedo for
a,
different areas differs, and you also factored that into the study somehow.
yes, the scientists, I think, well, if you already talked with Mark Shapiro or if you plan to have any, like Mark Stedler, like pretty sure, I think I'm getting myself into some troubles here because I'm starting discussions that,
Okay,
I don't know.
let's keep it cordoned off to your study. But this is very fascinating, of course. Now, you of course worked with American Airlines on this study. What's been the
Yes.
response from the American Airlines team? What are they going to do about this?
So for now, this links to a bigger question. So this has been a simulation done in our test environment. We showed the results to American. We showed it also to other customers, and they're all very intrigued to say the least, and they're all very excited to perform simulations. But our next step would be, okay, so we are doing the simulations. This seems to be the projected increase in fuel and cost that we might have if we actually decided to perform control avoidance. But how do we actually transform this into real flights? How do we go from a simulation, a test environment, to actual flight trials or to actual practical implementation? And this is when things start getting a bit more complicated. There seems to be certain reluctance within the airline community to start performing flight trials, even if the results seem to be very positive. And we think that there's two core reasons for this. The first one is, well, uncertainty, because we say, okay, yeah, you have to, you could potentially have a reduction in energy forcing of 80%, 70%, 90%, with an increase in fuel and cost of less than 0.1%, let's say. And they're like, yeah, this is great, but everything that is based on weather models is highly uncertain. So what happens if we are actually not correct? What happens if you say there could potentially be a reduction of this amount, but then we actually don't avoid contrails at all, and we just ended up, investing fuel or money that it's not gonna be returned.
Interesting, but your data is like tens of thousands of flights. This is not 5 flights or 20 flights that we're talking about. This is, a simulation of many thousands of flights.
Yes, 100%. And in terms, the good thing about FLIGHTKEYS is that in terms of fuel and cost predictions, we're actually very, very accurate. But the problem comes with the model uncertainties. So there is uncertainty surrounding contrails, if we can actually perfectly predict where they are forming and if we can actually avoid them this way. And I think that's where the question comes in. We can be, and also because it's hard to prove. So the only way we have of verifying contrails is you can have satellite images, you can have ground cameras, you can use past weather data to go over the existing flights, and you can say, okay, this flight generated a contrail. But it's hard to say that a flight that avoided a contrail area that was predicted really didn't create a contrail because they avoided a contrail
Where's the
area.
credit, right? There's no credit in hindsight.
Exactly. So it's easier to know when a flight, obviously, when a flight has produced a contrail, whereas a flight that hasn't produced a contrail, and why they haven't produced it. Was it because the prediction was wrong to begin with, or was it because they have indeed successfully
Avoided.
avoided a
Yeah.
contrail area? Which is very interesting, and I think it's now what the industry is moving towards. So there seems to be a consensus. There's more public visibility about contrails and non-CO2 effects, and it seems okay. Non-CO2 effects and contrails are a reality. They seem to be at least as warming as CO2, so this has to be taken seriously. And there's different ways that we could address it through SAF, through engine technology, but the most effective and cost-effective way of doing it seems to be through avoiding contrail areas. But how precisely can we predict these contrail areas, and how can we verify it? And as well, how then could we implement it? And I understand that airlines are hesitant to begin flight trials because what if we end up investing cost and fuel that finally we generate a contrail anyway? And now, with the whole carbon taxing and EU ETS and all of this, airlines don't want to put more CO2 that they're going to be charged for.
Charged for, yeah.
And on top, the public opinion, you are burning more CO2 and not getting any results. So we understand that this is something that is pushing them back, as well as, for example, the fact that, well, what if, they actually start taxing us on top for non-CO2, right? I think that airlines are kind of scared as well. So on the one hand, they are interested, but on the other hand, they're also scared of what might come from all
So
of these trials. And
so
this
let's
becomes a bit of like a chicken and the egg situation,
yeah, exactly.
where they are scared of the uncertainty and the money, so they don't want to perform flight trials. But if we don't perform flight trials and monitor flights, then we will never improve the uncertainty surrounding contrail modeling, and the
But
models will never improve, and blah blah.
haven't there flight trials being done already? I believe American Airlines itself conducted about 20 plus flight trials recently. I think that was in partnership with Google, if I'm not wrong. And also, the European Union has agreed to fund flight trials in the next couple of years with a group in Europe, isn't it?
Yes, no. So American did do a trial with Google and with Breakthrough Energy as well, and the results seem to be quite positive. The problem with these trials is that I think in order to have a meaningful knowledge or a meaningful conclusion of how control avoidance can be performed in a big scale, we really need a big amount of flights. So if we select 200 flights, most likely the conclusion, I mean, we can of course always learn from even the smallest simulations. There can always be meaningful conclusions coming out, but we would really need a big amount of flights in order to come up with meaningful solutions. For example, one problem that we see when we think of planning is that airlines, many times they plan which flights are going to perform control avoidance days in advance, right? They say, or weeks in advance even, they say, okay, because they have to train the dispatchers, they have to train the pilots, they're not going to train all of their staff, they're going to just say, okay, these 3 pilots which are going to perform these flights are going to be the ones that are going to perform control avoidance. And the next control flight is going to happen in 2 weeks from Chicago to New York. Tom Smith is going to do this flight with control avoidance. But then, I'm inventing it. But then we arrive on the day of the flight, and the flight from Chicago to New York is not generating contrails to begin with. So there's no control avoidance to do. Because the thing about contrails and in general weather reroutings is that it's very unpredictable, in the sense of you can't plan something many months in advance or weeks in advance when it's weather dependent, right? It's like when you plan
It can change, yeah. Weather can change. I live in London, so absolutely.
exactly. In your case, you plan to go to the beach this Saturday because it says it's going to be sunny, and then Saturday morning comes and it's raining and 10 degrees. What can you do, right? So the thing with trials is that we would need to simulate a big enough sample of thousands of flights, so that if this situation comes, we would still have meaningful results coming from these things. And you're right, the EU European Commission is going to fund. We're in it, so hopefully we're still waiting for approval, but
How
we
many
hope it's
flights will
going to
it fund?
come.
How many trials will it fund?
Thousands.
Thousands, right?
So this would be a big
So there you have
simulation.
you have your answer. You have your European Commission funded thousands of flights trials, which will then encourage other airlines to implement this, isn't it?
100%. But also another thing outside of the trials, so we can improve this whole thing through trials, but also through general monitoring. So outside of a control doing or not control avoidance, just by looking at which flights generate contrails, and as we see, finding patterns in this type of thing, in contrail formation, it's already very useful for the science. And this links to another of the European initiatives, with this the MRV, Monitoring, Reporting and Verification program. Is supposed to start in 2025, and there's been some lobbying against it from IATA and some airlines. So the idea was to establish this non-CO2 MRV for any flight that sets a foot in Europe. Either it leaves Europe, it lands in Europe, it flies
Is
across
that a
Europe, etc.
tax or what is it?
No, it's just to monitor. They're just requesting airlines that set a foot in Europe to monitor the non-CO2 emissions.
So why would someone like IATA oppose it?
I guess because, again, from our personal experience, is that they say that it's too uncertain. I think they're scared of taxation. They're scared of this, leading into some sort of legislation against non-CO2 emissions, when actually this is crucial, because also the biggest contrails, or the flights that seem to be most warming according to all of these studies, are the long haul flights. So flying a flight from Paris to Berlin, maybe we're not going to see such a high contrail impact as one that flies from New York to Berlin, right? So the MRB and in general monitoring schemes have to be as wide and ambitious as possible. I think that governments, the European Commission, IATA, every single of this type of organizations, we have to try to be innovative. Until now, there's been a very voluntary approach to everything with Corsia, with the MRV. They want it to be voluntary. No, airlines that want to provide the monitoring of non-CO2 should, but the airlines that don't, they don't need to. This is going to impact tourism. It's going to, I don't know. But this is not the correct approach, because that's what we can see at the moment. If there's no incentive or no reward for airlines to do it, they're not just going to do it voluntarily. In principle, it sounds very nice, right? We all want to improve the climate. We all are going to have kids or grandkids, and we all want them to live in a better world. But in practice, governments and policymakers should push more to have an innovative, more innovation and ambitious program to monitor and learn from sustainable practices.
Right. Right. I hear you. And I can see where someone like IATA or some airlines might be coming at this, that, oh, we are going to do a test, provide evidence so that we can be taxed. And we're not going to do that. Right. But I think at the same time, if the policy is such that there is a penalty or a surcharge for a warming contrail, and there is a credit or incentive for a cooling contrail, I think then more airlines might be up for doing a trial like this. Do you think this can become part of the policy, where there is an incentive or a contrail avoidance rebate that would incentivize airlines to adopt contrail management practices?
Could be. So I'm not, the thing is that I think we're not there yet. So I'm not a policymaker. But there's lots of debate of the carrot and the stick. Apparently, Europe is more on the stick approach. We tax if you do wrong, and US is more carrot approach. We give you benefits if you do the correct thing. And this is all a very good debate, but I think that so far we don't know what is the correct way of doing it, because we're not fully aware how to, or not fully aware. Well, like it's working on it, but we can't really 100% precisely link contrails to specific flights. And there's lots of work going on ground cameras, satellites, university, to improve all of these models. So I think that so far we're just not there yet. Seems like they're lobbying, or IATA and this type of organizations, they're lobbying against a possible taxation that is not in the time horizon immediately. First, we need to improve the science. We need to reduce the uncertainty. We need to get the airlines and ATC, like we still need to be able to incorporate this operationally. And through strategies like the MRV, then we're going to collect data so that organizations and policymakers, like organizations like, for example, Transport and Environment, which is helping policymakers to kind of like set this type of rules in place, can then set up a strategy that works, hopefully also for the airlines. Like we don't want to just punish the airlines for doing it wrong. I think it's in everybody's best interest, including us as flight plan providers, to have airlines fly, right? We don't want them to go bankrupt. We don't want them to keep paying for more and more things than they can't afford. We want aviation to continue. It's just that we want to do it better. And we have to have data in order to then do a legislation about it.
Right. I know we've talked about the depth of the research and the policy issues around it. Why should airlines care about their non-CO2 emissions? I think that's a bigger question, because I know a lot of airlines are looking at CO2 avoidance and CO2 emissions. Why do non-CO2 emissions matter? What percentage of total warming impact of aviation are we talking about from non-CO2?
For what has been studied so far, and contrails are not a new thing. So contrails are a thing that has been known since we started flying. So I think the first model to predict contrails was actually developed during the Second World War, because they could not produce contrails for different reasons, not from sustainability, but from military perspective. And then the topic picked up heat again in the 90s, with scientists that started studying what is the effect, what are the effects of these contrails, right? Meteorological scientists, because contrails are just like regular clouds, but clouds have a energy forcing balance. They can affect the radiative energy of the Earth. So what are these man-made clouds, and what is the effect that they have? And while studies, more and more studies keep shining more light into it, taking more flights from the past years and doing reanalysis data and all of them, what seems to always be the conclusion is that non-CO2 seems to be at least as important as CO2 in terms of the energy balance. So it's not, of course, CO2 is global. So whatever CO2 you put in Europe will end up having an impact in Australia, because the CO2 just stays in the atmosphere and kind of like spreads around. And contrails have a more local effect, but the effect that they have locally is actually as important or not more important than CO2. And specifically for Europe or the US, where is where most flights happen, and the ones that generate the most contrails as well, it seems to have quite an important effect.
So that's the interesting thing you mentioned. Let me pick up on that thread. The studies I've seen until now, a lot of these contrails, warming especially, happen over the North Atlantic. That means primarily US and European airlines are responsible. Of course, we've got the Emirates and the Qatars of the world who are flying across the Atlantic on their long haul routes. But does this mean that contrail avoidance is primarily a European and American thing to tackle, and not something that global airlines should be concerned about?
No, I think it's something that global airlines should be concerned about, certainly. It just happens that the big part of the world that flies is within the US and North America. I don't have figures for Qatar and Emirates, but I'm pretty sure that they will also have quite a big impact now that they're flying more and more and increasing their fleets. And in general, the general flying habits of countries that maybe 20 years ago were not flying so much, from China to the Middle East, now it's picking up a lot.
But the thing
And
is, a lot of these airlines, let's say China to the Middle East, or let's look at high growth regions like India, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, for example, a lot of these flights are happening in and around and over the equator, where perhaps the cooling atmosphere around the North Atlantic, the temperatures are very different, the weather patterns are very different, the cumulonimbus clouds that you find around the equator are not there over the North Atlantic. And you are then looking at a very different type of contrail formation, perhaps that is not warming, for a large majority of flights for an airline like Air India or Singapore Airlines or Lion Air, which Lion Air has zero flights, absolutely, to Europe or North Atlantic, right? And one of the fastest growing, or Indigo Airlines in India, once again, one of the largest, fastest growing airlines, zero flights over the North Atlantic. Should they even care? And if one day Indigo decides to fly nonstop to Europe, should they be subject to a contrail avoidance tax in Europe?
I think yes. So, I mean, I think everybody should care. I think that sustainability in aviation is something that we should all try to be better. And the good thing about contrail and non-CO2 avoidance is that it seems to be a very, let's be honest, cost-effective solution. It's a solution that we can start applying not in 30 years' time when SAF is more available, or that new engine technology has developed more, is something that we can start applying in the next 5 years. And it's going to have the biggest returns for the less cost investment. And you're right, maybe there's specific areas of the world where contrails are not as common. And then, their dispatchers, they're using their contrail, the contrail feature, and then they see, well, if American Airlines maybe has 11,000 flights that generate contrails, Air India has 20 flights. Well, good for Air India. That means that they don't have to avoid it. But then the 20 flights that do generate contrails, why, why discarding a specific sustainability topic just because you yourself are not so impacted by it as maybe the North American flights, and just because you don't fly the North American routes, if you are going to land in Europe and potentially over Europe, you could generate contrails. And again, it's a more cost efficient way to be more sustainable. And I think I saw your talk in Farnborough, um, and I could really relate to you because I am also a frequent traveler. I don't live in the country where I am, and I fly way more than maybe the average person. And I want to make smart decisions in my travels, and I want to make aviation better for the world and for everything. And I wish that all airlines would just apply sustainability measures for voluntarily. But of course, that's not going to happen. And maybe, yeah, again, and we're not even talking about taxation yet. But the MRV, if Air India has to monitor their non CO2 emissions, just because for them to land in Europe, they have to. Maybe that also gives them a good, they have a better sense of what non CO2 effect they actually have. And if it's very little, then great for them. They don't have to do anything about it. But if it's considerable, then they have a way to start maybe tackling a problem that at the beginning we're not even aware that they have, and the way of tackling is more cost efficient than other sustainability measures. Not to say that SAF or engine technology is not as important. It's definitely very important. We're not trying to minimize CO2 here by contrail avoidance, but at it.
Okay, and I hear you. See, when I speak with airline CEOs, airport CEOs, they have two priorities. Yes, they want to focus on sustainability, but the sustainability of their business is just as important. And airlines already have, 30% of their expenses as fuel costs, and SAF will definitely bring those costs up further. We have seen airlines like Lufthansa recently add a environmental surcharge to all their flights, for example. But simple things like contrail avoidance, if it's going to bump up costs, not just fuel costs, now that I've learned, bump up overall costs by 2-3%, it's a concern. But if it's
Zero
0.1%,
points. Yeah,
exactly. If
exactly.
it's 0.1%, I think that's very encouraging. That's the most encouraging thing I've learned today, which is just the big hit list, right? 0.5% increase, 0.05%, I think you said, percent increase in overall costs while avoiding a large, significant percent of the warming impact from contrails, over 70%.
Exactly. And so we don't see, when they say, oh, but you're going to burn more CO2, you're throwing away CO2. We're not throwing away CO2. It's making, like it's kind of like a risk benefit analysis. For every flight, you can say, okay, how much fuel do I have to invest in order to reroute specific contrail areas? What is the potential reduction in energy forcing that I have? And overall, what is the climate impact that my flight is going to have with this fuel burn, but avoiding these contrails? And this is something that we also talk about in our study. So we can transform energy forcing into CO2 equivalent. So there's like a formula where you more or less can make a comparison between how much CO2 this would be. So you transform the warming into the CO2 warming equivalents. And still with the increase of 0.05% in fuel, we still have a reduction of, wait, let me check the numbers. The reduction in total warming for the big hits in this situation would be of 19.85%. So despite the fuel increase, you're still having your flights are less warming by 20% comparatively. So you're not throwing CO2. You're smartly investing CO2 to have a less impact in a total set of flights, right?
And here's the important thing to me. There are very few things that airlines can do today to reduce their warming impact on through aviation, and contrail avoidance is one of those things. And yes, we can wait till the cows go home for scientists to come to a consensus, But I'm ready for an airline or two or 10 to raise their hands, stick their necks out, and say, you know what, we're going to give this a shot and share the results with the world. So I'm very encouraged by the initial results that the Flight Keys team has produced from the simulation, and I'm truly hoping that more airlines adopt and give this a trial.
There certainly is interest. So from our side, we can say many of our customers are very interested in it. Even some of our non-customers are also interested in working with us and with the EU projects being funded, etc. I think that this is gonna, I mean, I'm sure that contrail avoidance, or I'm positive that contrail avoidance will be something that will be talked more and more in the coming years, and hopefully we find a strategy to actually implement it in next years. Again, the MRB is supposed to begin 2025, so that maybe shines some light on how this could then be legislated in terms of taxing or rewards or none. Let's just see. And maybe we're not talking taxing in the next 5 years. I don't know. But certainly, this is a topic that I think is here to stay and that will improve also the way we fly. This has also shined light in, for example, the fact that you say, okay, but we're going to burn 0.11% more fuel. And you say, well, you were not flying the most fuel optimal route to begin with, right? So you could fly the most fuel optimal route, but that might not be the most cost optimal route. So there's like, oh, but we can't just burn 0. Whatever percent more fuel. Well, you're already not, in some cases they are, but it's not always the main priority to just save fuel over cost.
Right.
It never has been. And this might start shifting the way we fly. This might, really start the discussion on how can we fly better in terms of contrails, but also in terms of fuel and in terms of how the airspace is being handled. And so I think we're in a and it's very. I'm sorry, I'm ranting a bit. It's very
That's fine.
encouraging.
This is a long form podcast.
True. It's very encouraging to see that, we don't want to just sit on the side, wait 30 years for big changes to happen in aviation. I think it's very encouraging to see people that want to see aviation get better now, today, and how we
Indeed.
can do that, if not through, the coolest engines available, because they're they are already the coolest engines available, but if this might not be in the market until several years from now, okay, what can we do now?
Right.
And
Exactly.
everybody's is in it.
Fantastic.
Airlines, flight dispatchers, operator, no, like manufacturers. So it's good. It's
Yeah, I have
encouraging to see.
one final question, which is around the technology. I believe Flight Keys is working on integrating contrail avoidance into flight plan technology, so that it's part of the cockpit, it's part of the what pilots do anyway. Can you share more details about this project and its expected impact?
Yes, so FlightKeys has now implemented it in both the flight dispatching software. So this is what flight dispatchers use. Flight dispatchers usually sit on their computers between 3 and 12 hours before departure, and then they select which routes they're going to file, and then they file this to the authorities approve them, and then this route gets sent to the cockpit, where the pilots then get to fly it. So both our flight dispatching tool for pre-tactical avoidance is equipped with contrail avoidance, and then our EFB tool, so electronic flight bag for pilots in flight, also has contrail avoidance. And the goal would be to combine both. So you can, and this is nothing new. This is how, for example, turbulence is handled today. You have the dispatchers trying to, with the best of their knowledge at the time, with the best weather forecast 3 hours before departure, select a route that avoids turbulence, or in this case contrails, as much as possible. Then they file the flight plan. The pilot gets it, it looks at it, and then during flight, if they encounter turbulence, or in this case, if because again, 3 hours before departure to actually right now here, especially in a long haul flight, how will the weather have changed in this time shift? And then they can request ATC for a flight level change, for example, to avoid a turbulence that they didn't account for before, or a contrail area that was not there before flight. So we think this is going to be a flight dispatcher, but also pilot centric approach. Like pilots they're the ones at the end who are gonna perform the actual avoidance, and they have to be in it as well, and they have to be trained for it, and they have to And I think this is also cool for we have many pilots in the company, and I think that they are also very engaged and they also want to learn how they can fly better and how they can be more climate focused. And usually our EFB Loretta tool looks very cool. And yeah, so our goal is to keep implementing always the newest models. So again, working with breakthrough energy, Google research, etc. And they're always improving their models using machine learning technology and all of these things. We were in the contrails workshop last week and we learned a lot about what is being done out there, and people there are brilliant. They're amazing what they're working on. But again, I'm not the person to try to explain what they're doing. But it's amazing. And then so then we implement this and we perform like the bridge between this brilliant academic people who develop all of this and who try to improve the models, and also the way of verifying afterwards. So with satellites, cameras, this and that, and the operators. So we're like the bridge between both.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on the role FLIGHTKEYS has played. Congratulations on your work over the last 3-4 years on contrails. I'm very excited to see the results of the study, and I'm truly hopeful that more airlines will proactively look into this and be part of this experiment, hopefully which will produce positive results.
Yes, 100%. I'm confident.
Thank you, Alejandra. Now the final part of this interview is called the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally.
Okay.
We'll start with something very simple, like what's your favorite book?
That is simple. That's I don't know.
It's a tough one, huh?
It's a very tough one. The last book I read that I liked, it's called The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Secret History, I think it is.
The secret history of what? The world or the airline?
No, it's secret. No, the airline world. No, as I told you before, I'm usually trying to separate my once I'm out of the office, I try to disconnect.
No more contrails. No more
contrails. No, it's like a mystery murder.
Oh wow, the secret world. Okay, I'll check it out.
It has like a bit of a dark vibe. I like it. I'm
boy.
now into mystery books.
Okay, what's your favorite airline?
That is also a tough one. The last airline that surprised me positively, that I flew and it was amazing, was Aeromexico.
Really? What did you like about it?
I don't know. The people were very good. I mean, I only flew it once. I was in Mexico. Last year I was in Mexico with some friends and we took some flights. The people were amazing. They offered you complimentary drinks and snacks, which is something that European airlines never do. They had like super new seats, the like screens with games and movies and series. It was for a 2-hour flight. It was not like it's a 6-hour flight, so they're giving you no. And I was really positively surprised. It was very nice. So Aeromexico is going to be it. Okay, fantastic. Your favorite airport? Do you have a favorite airport? I have a favorite airport. I would say Madrid. Terminal 4, very beautiful. Okay. Like it. Yes, it's the new one. Favorite city? I would say Madrid and Vienna. Okay. They have my heart. All right, one where you grew up in and one where you're living now. Exactly. What is the best advice you've received? A good advice that I've received and that I try to apply day to day is to be proud of the small things. Because many times I think that, you reserve pride, or I used to reserve pride like for a big accomplishment, right? Like you think, I'm going to be very proud of myself if I win the Nobel Prize. But actually, I think pride is the motivation that leads you to achieve the Nobel Prize. So you have to reward yourself and not be too critical of yourself and kind of like celebrate the small goals, because that's how you keep growing and how you push yourself more. Fantastic. Very, very important point. What do you do in your free time? I really like sports. I do lots of sports. I hang out with my friends, with my boyfriend. And I just have one final question, which is what is something you want to learn? Um, I would like to say I would like to learn German, but to
Well,
be
you're
fair,
in
I'm not.
Austria, you can give it a shot.
I'm trying, but I don't have much time for it. But something that it's not as cool, but one of my personal goals for this year is to learn to do like a chin up. Was never
Okay.
able to do a chin up, and it's by the end of 2024 gonna do a chin up.
I love the simple bite-sized goals you have. Alejandra, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this chat. I learned so many new things, including a new word. So, very exciting. And I think you're doing great work, and continue and keep it up.
Thank you very much. Same here. And think about the word next time, you're in the slopes or you're in the sea too. When they say in the sea, the sun gets reflected and you get burned everywhere.
Mm-hmm. That's
Same
it.
idea.
That's what's happening. Thank you so much.
Be careful. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simpliflying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simpliflying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simpliflying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.